First of all, let me just say it's a real treat to be here. Max has told me so much about this institution. This room is just full of beautiful people, even though the weather outside is awful. It's really nice to see so many attentive faces who want to talk about fake news, the state of political campaigning, and journalism. As Danny said, most of my work is done in the context of political campaigns, and specifically how changes in technology change the way elections are won and lost. And what I want to do today is tell a story based on my research about how we should think about fake news through the lens of political identity and the broader set of things that political campaigns try to do. And I'll make an argument both about how contemporary politics and political campaigning works. That gives us a lens onto how we should understand the contemporary public sphere and political journalism. And I want to leave lots of time for us to have a good Q&A and answer questions and hopefully sort of have a debate and discussion about a number of, I think, the challenges that we face as a democracy in the United States today. And hopefully maybe think a little bit together about where should we go from here. How do we have a conversation about the quality of information in the public sphere, about what we owe each other in terms of being citizens, and how we think about being Americans, and what's the state of our democracy. So I'm going to talk about fake news in context. Does this work? Did we get the clicker working? Sweet. Great. All right, so I want to do three key things today. First, I'm going to make an argument and sort of lay out the basis for why campaigns look different than they looked like 20, 30 years ago, okay? Why this is not the world of electioneering, of campaigns of the 1980s and even the 1990s. What looks radically different today, and what challenges does that pose, not only for journalism, but for campaigners themselves? How does that world look different, okay? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about one area where we see these changes. This comes from most of my own work, but I'll tell a story about journalism too, where the people who actually work on campaigns now are just as likely to come from Google and Silicon Valley as they are from Washington, D.C. in a political consulting firm. In part, given the ways that technologies now change everything that we do in electoral politics and in journalism. And then finally, I'm going to pull back a bit and think about 2016. I'll talk a bit about fake news. I'll talk a little bit more about targeted political advertising. In part, you might have been hearing all the national headlines about things like Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and the like. This is a really big story. It's a disturbing story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, because fake news is part of that broader phenomenon. So I want to put it in that context. And then I'll leave you with a set of arguments about sort of what democracy is and what it should be. And then hopefully we can have a good time to have a conversation together, okay? And feel free to call out any clarifying questions as I go through. The aim is to talk for about, about 30 minutes or so and then have Q&A time. Okay, let me start by talking about this idea of technology-intensive campaigning. And this was central to my book, Prototype Politics. But one of the arguments that I make in that book, based on lots of research from many different sources and talking to many different people who do politics, is that the world changes really fast, right? If you think about the world of political campaigns, really since Dwight Eisenhower, who was the first candidate to run television ads, really up through George W. Bush's second campaign, the world kind of looked the same. Campaigns would buy 30-second television advertising spots. They would figure out who they needed to appeal to in the electorate, what sort of message they were going to say, and craft an advertisement that meant to speak to them and run it out over the airwaves, right? In the late 1960s, you could buy an ad on any of the three networks and hit upwards of 90% of the American public by airing that ad on prime time, right? Something happened around 2004 where in order to reach 90% of the American public today, you'd have to advertise across hundreds of different platforms, hundreds of different social media sites, because people consume media in a much more fragmented, much more time-shifted way than they once did. So this is a quote. I'm going to throw up some data here. One of my primary sources of data is interviews. I'll walk you through these. You don't have to spend time reading them. But I sat down with Michael Slaby, who was the Chief Technology Officer for Obama's campaign in 2008. And then his Chief Integration and Innovation Officer for Obama 2012. It's a complicated title, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. And I asked him, well, what changed from 2008 and 2012? If you remember 8 years ago, the Obama campaign in 2008, he was the Facebook candidate, right? Brand new candidate, technologically sophisticated campaign. And I said, what was different when you sat down to do his re-election bid? And he said two things. He said, first of all, the campaign in 2008 wasn't perfect. It looked good from the outside, but it wasn't perfect. But the second thing he said, which really stuck with me, was the world moved on us in 4 years. The pace of current technological change is unbelievable. It's accelerated. One great example I love to use, how many of you have a Twitter account? Maybe a third of the room, right? Who's our most famous Twitterer-in-chief? The president, right? One great example I love to illustrate this pace of technological change is that back in 2008, I remember asking the Obama team, I was like, who ran your Twitter account? And the director of new media for that campaign was like, I don't even remember. It was like an intern in the basement or somebody. And I looked and it was like, Obama's victory tweet in 2008 was retweeted 157 times, shared 157 times, right? Fast forward 4 years to 2012 even, not even 2018, 2012, and Twitter is at the center of the political universe. It's the key way that campaigns are communicating with journalists. Obama's victory tweet back in 2012 was retweeted or shared over 800,000 times within 24 hours, right? So think about the pace of that technological adoption just in those 4 short years. Requires campaigns and journalists to navigate an entirely new technological environment. One great example of this is what the back-end data infrastructure looked like for the Obama 2012 campaign. Needless to say, it's complicated. All the stories about Cambridge Analytica that you're reading about currently and Facebook and their role, it's all premised on data and political data. And this is a big part of contemporary politics, which I'm going to talk more about. But basically what happens is that firms like Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, the Democratic Party have massive voter files on every member of the electorate. So over 300 points of data on every member of the electorate. Not only which party you're registered to, but usually race and ethnicity data, census data, property data. Anytime anybody ever showed up at your house and asked you a question, whether you might be planning on turning out to vote, and who you might be turning out to vote for, and what issues really mattered to you, if a political party ever did that or a candidate, that gets stored in political databases and it's used in future appeals. Lots of commercial data too. If you have a grocery club card, right, for a Harris Teeter or something, that data gets shared with political campaigns and makes its way into political databases. If you subscribe to magazines, that data makes its way into political databases. And this has been a huge shift really since 2004 in political spaces, is that there's a lot more political data about you. This is why the Cambridge Analytica data breach is such a big story. It's because political databases have gotten massive. And campaigns now use that data to figure out how do we reach and target the electorate with the messages we want the electorate to hear. So when you hear things like polarization and the like, one of the things that's driving it is hyper-targeted advertising, speaking to people on the basis of what they know about them and what's going to get them emotionally riled up, right? And to make that appeal to people. So that's one big story about politics, is that you see this profusion of political data. The second thing you see is using all this data to figure out, well, how do we appeal to people? And this includes things like fake news, which I'll get to in a little bit, but fake news is also premised on data because certain outside interests figured out, well, we could circulate fake stories and we could look and see who's sharing those stories, who's responsive to those stories, who's engaging with those stories, and we could do it in a targeted strategic basis in order to benefit the candidate or the cause that I really want. On the political end of things, they do things like relational advertising. So they take all that data that I just mentioned, and they figure out, well, how do we get our candidate's message on a TV screen, but then also echoed by the person who's coming to your door, but also by the Facebook ad that you're going to see, and then that email that you're going to get from some political cause, and then on a telephone from some political canvasser. All of it is really done in a relational way, what people in the industry call a unified look at who you are on the basis of what they know about you based on the data that you share in the course of your everyday life. And you're going to get political messages not only from direct mail, but from internet advertising and increasingly television advertising. Most people don't realize this, but how many of you have cable? Fair number of the room, right? The big area of political innovation is cable set-top box television advertising. So based on what shows you watch and when you watch them, political advertisers will buy advertising to try to appeal to you. So not everybody is even seeing the same advertisements anymore. It's increasingly targeted through what they know about you based on the data that your cable provider is providing back to organizations like ComScore, et cetera, that's basically selling your data to political advertisers. That's the world we're in. The other world we're in is the world of things like Snapchat. How many of you have a Snapchat account? Yeah, all my young students in the room. Some not so young students in the room. I can't figure out Snapchat, I have to say. My undergrads constantly, I feel like they have to I relearn it every semester. They're like, Dr. Cruz, you really should be on this. It's like, I get there, it's like, no idea what I'm doing. But Snapchat is another great example of that technological change. Remember I talked earlier about how Twitter all of a sudden became a big deal in 2012, or it wasn't in 2016. Snapchat became a really big deal during the 2016 election, primarily as a way for campaigns to engage with younger voters. This is just a screenshot. Bernie Sanders, who's a big innovator in this space, created a geo-filter, which simply means that anytime you take a snap in a particular place, you can overlay Bernie Sanders' message to it. One of the things the Bernie Sanders campaign found is that one of the best ways to reach young people was through Snapchat, a platform that didn't really even exist in 2012. Certainly not in the way that it was useful as a political tool, but now very much a key way that campaigns are looking to speak to and engage with younger voters in particular. So, cycle of technological change. Now I'll move relatively briefly through this, but one of the things that we've seen is that given this rapid pace of technological change, the people who engage in politics look a lot different than they did even 15 years ago. Okay? And it's actually true on the journalism side too. One of my collaborators now, Matt Weber, who's a scholar at Rutgers, has been tracking similar changes to what I'm going to show you in politics in the journalism space. So increasingly people with computer science engineers, for instance, being in the newsroom. That's a new phenomenon. Things look a little different than they used to. So let me show you just a little bit about what I found. This is complicated, but just to walk you through the story really quickly. A big story about politics is that we have professionals who practice politics on a regular basis, campaign cycle after campaign cycle. But what me and my graduate students did was we built a really big data set where we took everybody we could identify through Federal Election Commission filings to figure out who actually worked on campaigns in the areas of technology, digital media, data, and analytics. The big four areas for what we're going to talk about today with fake news and advertising, et cetera. And we figured out that we could go to, how many of you have a LinkedIn profile? Few people, right? So that's where you list your entire career history, right? Well, we scraped that data for all those people we were able to identify in the political space and figured out what sorts of careers do they have. And what we found was that there's actually lots of people who come from places like the tech industry in Silicon Valley to work in politics. And the reason why is because as technologies change so rapidly, they want to recruit people from industry and bring them in to figure out how do we navigate this world of fake news or this world of Facebook or this world of Twitter in a more effective way to benefit our candidate? So this is just a graph that came from my book where we looked at the careers, the primary backgrounds of people who worked in politics. And one of the things that we found was that out of, let's say, 342 total staffers on the Obama 2012 campaign, only 72 had previous campaign work. And a significant number of people were coming from places like the data and analytics industry, in places like Chicago or other high-tech startups. One great example is Carol Davidson. I love to talk about her, A, because there's not enough women who work in politics, and B, because she was one of the unsung heroes for the Obama 2012 campaign, who doesn't get anywhere near the credit she deserves. But she's a really great example of somebody who came from commercial industry. She's about my age, so she came up in a time back in the old days when you used to get charged, if you guys remember this, based on zip code for how much your call would cost. You guys, none of the young folks in the room probably remember that world, but you used to have to figure out, like, call on a zip code, how much a call would cost. And she got her start actually working in big data, figuring out how do you do billing systems and charge people for, based on their call and the duration of that call, et cetera. She gave money to the Obama 2008 campaign and listed the fact that she worked in the data and analytics industry. And in 2012, the Obama team realized, look, we need industry experience to help us run this campaign and navigate this new technological landscape. So they looked through and they identified her as being one of those people, and they hired her onto the campaign. And she created, in essence, that system of cable set-top box targeting that the Obama campaign used so effectively. Now she heads up the political unit for ComScore, which is the largest political advertising company in the country. They do commercial, but she heads up their political side. The other thing that we tracked and found a lot of is that there's all sorts of new organizations and lots of entrepreneurship in the political space. We see this in journalism too. Companies like BuzzFeed, for instance, that didn't exist 10 years ago, all of a sudden are winning Pulitzer Prizes and being at the center of the universe. So we actually looked at entrepreneurship and found that there are all these new organizations that get founded by presidential campaign veterans who want to start their new commercial ventures in politics. That was the Republican list. The Democrats had a much more robust ecosystem that helps them do things like place digital advertising, digital campaigning, et cetera. This just comes from some of our network data where we can show all these firms and all these new ventures that get founded around presidential cycles and the like. Then the other thing that we did, and this will be a nice segue into 2016, is we started to look, we're still analyzing a lot of the data for the 2016 campaign. We'll have it out pretty soon. But we looked at staffers who actually work in digital advertising. And a couple of patterns we find is that Democrats tend to use a lot more sort of internal campaign staffers than Republicans do. So this is just Bernie Sanders. Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, John Kasich tend to hire outside firms to do a lot of work. This is where the Cambridge Analytica story comes in. They're actually a firm external to the Trump campaign who are hired by it to do a lot of their data work, whereas Dems do stuff inside. And then you see huge disparities between things like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump when it comes to staffers internal to their campaign that are specialists in things like technology or digital media or data and analytics. Which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. One interesting note, this is exclusive data to you guys. This is super interesting. Remember I said we had that LinkedIn data set early on so we could look at people's entire careers? Well, one of the things that we did for 2016 was we looked at education. Does anyone remember the phrase, the best and the brightest, right, from the Vietnam War era? One of the really striking things that we found is that Democrats pretty exclusively hire people from top private universities. So if you look, these are the top 15 degree granting schools who are on, this is every Democrat in our data set who's worked in politics. Harvard, Stanford, NYU, there's Cal Berkeley in there, but elite, mostly coastal city universities. Republicans, by contrast, do a much better job hiring from state schools across the country, state universities. So you see UT Austin, you'll see Brigham Young, but University of Alabama, Ohio State is in there. Different set, LSU, different set of universities here. So when you think about who's responsible for crafting those messages that are speaking to the everyday publics, I think it very much is true, and we're still doing a lot more of the analysis here, that Republicans have a better representation of the slice of America than the Democrats do. And we want to think about sort of what that means for the sorts of messages that you might hear about political campaigns. All right, now 2016. Let's get to fake news. Let's get to micro-targeting and messaging and advertising and journalism and what's the journalist's role in all this. And then we can have a broader conversation about whatever it is that you guys want to talk about. Okay. Place to start. Fake news. How many of you have seen this? Yeah, so this is the highest performing piece of fake news from the 2016 election. It went absolutely viral on Facebook, and you can see from the headline, if you can't read it off to the side, Pope Francis shocks the world, endorses Donald Trump for president, releases statement. Clearly false. The Pope was not endorsing of Donald Trump in 2016. For anyone who knew the Pope and the Pope's politics, you know that this was highly unlikely, given who the Pope is. My grandfather constantly calls me up and complains about how liberal the Pope is. So he knew that there's no way this was happening, but he's not on Facebook. My grandfather's 94. Right, so clearly a bit of fake news that absolutely goes viral. And in this context, I think it frames a broader question of what sorts of messages are people seeing, are people interacting with, particularly on social media sites, and what are they choosing to engage with? And then there's the broader question of to what effect, right? What effect does this actually have on electoral politics? There's a couple of pernicious things about the fake news phenomenon. And I should say fake news, it's a contested and broad category of stuff. Sometimes it's a political critique that the president makes against legitimate news that he doesn't necessarily like. In other cases, it's deliberate falsehoods that's meant to misinform. And in some contexts, it's simply about fake stories that are designed to be monetized in some way by getting people to engage with it. But it has a couple of common elements, and I think what makes it so pernicious is that this is a screenshot from Facebook. On Facebook, it's not easy to tell what's real and what's true by its design and its markers of authenticity, right? So on Facebook, everything looks the same, whether it comes from the Washington Post or whether it comes from an entirely fake local broadcast outlet, right? There's no institutional. I'm one of those old school people who still gets the newspaper delivered 5 days a week, right? And when there's a paper delivered to me, it has a masthead and it lists its editorial board. And it would be a lot of work for somebody to fake, right, a 100-page newspaper every day. Whereas it's pretty easy to fake content that looks real on a platform like Facebook, and to do some of the trappings of institutional news in a way that's going to mislead people. So in some ways, this is kind of a salacious headline, Pope Francis shocks world, but not out of keeping with a lot of other headlines that particularly works in the context of digital media. You can sort of see there's a clear institutional source, WTOE News. It has all the sorts of the markings of what an institutional news story would look like. So people can be deliberately and easily fooled, especially if they're not thinking, right, about fake news. Okay, so what do we know about the effect of fake news on the 2016 election? This is the rigorous study to date. This is by two Stanford economists who What they looked to do was to say, what's the prevalence of fake news based on all the other messages that people are actually awash in the context of their daily lives. And what they found was that even though fake news had this outsized cultural influence that everyone was talking about all the time, if you actually look at the numbers, it's a very small part of what people were actually exposed to in the course of their daily life when it came to politics. And their conclusion was that a single fake article, if it were to change the outcome of the election, would need to have the same persuasive effect as 36 campaign advertisements, right? Why? Because there was just so much more television advertisements and digital advertisements than fake news articles. And in fact, what people actually saw a lot more of was claims by the Hillary Clinton campaign and claims by the Donald Trump campaign, so much so that the Pope Francis story, right, was a very minor part of what people saw. And what we know from things like political psychology was that if you were going to believe in the Pope Francis story, chances are you're already going to be a Trump supporter to begin with, right? I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, so why do we care so much about fake news if that's that's the story in some way? My argument would be one reason we care a lot about fake news is because we have a lot of anxieties about democracy itself, right? We have this good civic ideal where people in the course of an election work really hard to understand politics. They want to read and consume good information. They want to weigh the policies of the two candidates, right? And then they want to figure out, what do I believe? What do I believe is in the best interest of the country, but also for myself and my family? And then they want to choose the candidate that best represents, right, all that research that they put into things. The story that political scientists tell is actually very different than that, though. What political scientists say through 70 years now of empirical evidence is that politics doesn't work that way at all. Or if it does, that's only for a very small group of the electorate. For most of us, we're partisans first and foremost. We're Democrats and Republicans first and foremost. And we choose the candidate that best represents us based on our partisan identification, not the rational weighing of information one way or another. Okay? So what they call, this is Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels. They wrote a really big book, came out after the 2016 election, called Democracy for Realists. Basically what they argue is that how democracy actually works is that people are members of social groups first and foremost, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, whether it's racial and ethnic groups, whether it's religious groups. And what people look to do is vote the way that their social groups vote first and foremost. And that's why you get a story where 90% of Democrats pulled the lever for Hillary Clinton and 90% of Republicans pulled the lever for Donald Trump at the end of the day, according to exit polls, best evidence that we have. People vote on the basis of their pre-existing group and their identifications. In this world, what campaigns are about are reminding voters of their political identities, not conveying substantive information on matters of policy. What it is to say, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you should vote with me, right? That's the way that political campaigns actually work. Just to show you some examples of how this works on social media, and why fake news is a small phenomenon in that context. Oh, I jumped ahead. This is basically, I'm just contrasting, this goes back to the social media story. The Trump team spent about $90 million on Facebook advertising in the closing weeks of the election, running anywhere from, see, there's various numbers on this, but basically 175,000 different variations of ads that were meant to appeal to you in particular ways. That is a much more significant outlay than something like fake news, right? Just to show you sort of an example of this, right? So like, you know, these are some examples of Trump's targeted digital advertising. Big, broad themes, right? Our country's getting ripped off. We must stop losing money overseas. Immigration reform. We don't have a country without borders. We need to build a wall. It's about policy. It's also about sort of appealing to, these were targeted to Republicans, right? Meant to appeal to Republicans on the basis of particular issues that he was stressing at that moment in time. One of the interesting things that I show in my work, I'll go just quickly through this, is that the Trump team, which had very few staffers, which I showed you before, relied a lot on social media firms themselves, like Google, Twitter, and Facebook, to actually provide a lot of their targeting and a lot of their expertise. So one of the interesting things that we saw this election cycle, remember I told you earlier that story where people came from Silicon Valley to work on campaigns? Donald Trump actually went directly to Silicon Valley and said, you're actually going to help us spend our money for the first time. This is a Twitter representative who was sort of talking about this. We did it, Facebook did it, Google did it. It worked and it's free labor. The reason why technology firms do this kind of stuff is because they want to sell their advertising and their dollars to campaigns. This is an example. I was at the DNC in Charlotte and spent some time with Facebook there. Facebook's entire platform is built around selling advertising that speaks to you individually. They get paid based on how much you engage with the advertisements that they run. Can you take a guess about what kind of advertisements are most likely to get you to care about them? Emotional appeals on the basis of your identity. You don't want to see information you don't agree with. You're going to be more likely to engage in stuff that you're going to engage with, and you're going to find emotional and highly salacious. Facebook monetizes this and then sells it on the basis of a lot of the data that they have. This is the same reason why fake news was so effective at going viral, was because Facebook's algorithms actually reward things that you're already engaging with, and it gets more reach and more play. And Facebook provides a lot of services around this. This is just an example. They actually have a help desk that they do in places like politics where they sell advertising revenue and services. And just to give you a sense of how this works, they also have dedicated account representatives. This is the account representative for Google, who's basically saying, we're going to help you figure out how to reach millennials online. We're going to figure out how to help you reach moms online. We're going to figure out how to reach Republicans online. And then we're going to help you design advertisements and content, even organic content, that's going to appeal to them in particular ways. And the whole point is that it's actually what people are going to be most engaged in. And the story about the Trump campaign in 2016 is that they relied on these technology firms in a much more important way than Hillary Clinton's team did. So this kind of captures it in big screaming bold letters. Clinton viewed us as vendors, meaning we're just going to go and ask you to execute what we've already decided to do. Whereas one of the powerful things about the Trump team was that we're actually going to partner with you. We're going to treat you like a consultant, and you're going to tell us how to best spend our money. And that's what they did with Facebook and Google and other places. And just to get a sense, we talked about fake news, but everybody makes these identity-based appeals in the context of politics. It's a central way that contemporary politics works. So these are just some examples of Hillary Clinton's targeted advertising. Again, this is not about persuading people on the basis of policy. This is about, I'm a Hillary voter, add my name, right? Or wish Hillary a happy Mother's Day. Now, there's not a lot of Republicans who are going to be like, yes, I really want an opportunity to wish Hillary Clinton a happy Mother's Day, right? It's designed to appeal to people who are already going to be agreeing with a matter of policy in one dimension. That's how fake news works, and that's how advertising works. It's how contemporary politics works. Here's another great example, right? So Hillary Clinton is not running targeted ads to persuade people. It's all about appeals that are stand with Hillary to stop Trump, right? Stand against Trump's racist ban on Muslim integration, right? Notice it's not, we're going to debate this on the merits. It's that we're going to make an appeal to you based on where we think you're already with us. And that's the way it works. And this works everywhere. This is just another great example. This comes from Facebook. This is one of their sponsored posts where it's basically appealing to pro-choice women, right? Join Women for Hillary. Fight back against Donald Trump's anti-choice sort of legislation and appeal. And again, the thing about Facebook that makes it so powerful is that people can share ads and paid content in a way that then travels through social networks. And what we know from social science is that people's social networks tend to be made up of like-minded people, right? So then the information that you're seeing, even from people sharing, even if it's not fake, it might be paid content from a political campaign or for an advertiser that's going to be more likely to share in that context. I love this slide. This was a collection of all their digital advertising that was designed against Trump, right? So you can sort of see, again, big, visual, emotional, right, graphics, not designed to convince a Trump supporter to be like, oh, I'm going to rethink my position on this candidate on the basis of this appeal coming from Hillary Clinton. No, it's like, nope, stop Trump, right? And all this stuff is tested to be sort of what's going to get the most engagement at that moment in time. Now, it's not just them, right? We're awash in these appeals. So things don't have to be fake news. They can be just targeted identity appeals, right? Marco Rubio, right? Like, Obama's the worst negotiator since Jimmy Carter, right? Like if you agree. Here's one from Ted Cruz. Do you trust Hillary Clinton? Yes or no, right? Like sign if you agree. What they want you to do is actually give over your email address so they can keep going back to you and then target you in other ways, right? So the targeting then would come maybe in a direct mailer, or it might come in a television advertisement, et cetera. It doesn't matter. A couple other great examples. I love this one. This is Ted Cruz. Obama wants your guns, right? Like, want our guns, come and take them, because Ted's out on the prairie. He's Harvard educated. I mean, I don't know much about his personal life, but he's clearly performing an identity here of a Texan and a gun rights supporter, right? Again, like very much sort of, and again, when we talk about fake news, I think we have to put things in a broader context of things, right? Does Obama really want everyone's guns? He didn't. I mean, he certainly was much more moderate, and maybe secretly he wanted to take everyone's guns. But that not as a matter of public policy. He wanted stricter gun control legislation, but not necessarily take everyone's guns. These are my favorite. Does anyone know what these are? These are the Russian inauthentic ads from this cycle. Again, it's kind of a weird category. Is this fake news or not? It's not quite fake news. It's not purporting to be news, but it is making an identity-based appeal. The ads that Russian interests bought were actually quite small when compared with the reach that these sites had. So if you can't read this, this was an ad set up by a Russian-sponsored account called Army of Jesus. And they basically produced a bunch of these graphics that's, as you can see, pretty bold. Satan, if I win, Clinton wins. And Jesus is out there arm wrestling and saying, not if I can help it, right? If this is going to appeal to you, you already know what side you're on, right? Like this isn't about appealing to an undecided voter. This is pretty clear. I struggle with this, to talk about this. This is a Bernie Sanders coloring book that a fake Russian account set up under the banner LGBT United, so a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, purportedly rights group that's sort of meant to appeal to Bernie Sanders supporters to get them sort of all in and say, look, Bernie Sanders, because you can color him and the White House rainbow is a big LGBTQ supporter. And again, these things had hundreds of thousands of views and engagements and interactions on elections. All right, my last sort of category of thing just to talk about, and then we'll have a conversation in the context of fake news. This is just a screenshot from Breitbart. Again, this is one of those weird categories, right? When we talk about fake news, what are we actually talking about? Breitbart, during this election, had such an outsized influence. It was the 44th most trafficked website in the United States during the 2016 election. It had hundreds of millions of views. And scholars such as Yochai Benkler and other people at MIT have found that they drove a lot of the narrative online. So much so that they were really at the center of a right-wing online ecosystem, much more so than Fox News, which is really interesting. But one of the things that they sort of argue is that fake news is not quite the right term to think about the role that Breitbart, and I would argue advertising plays. So what they argue is that fake news, which implies made of whole cloth by politically disinterested parties out to make a buck, is wrong. It's not an adequate term. By repetition, variation, and circulation through many associated sites, they make claims that are kind of dubious, familiar to readers, and it's fluency really with a narrative or a story, often about identity, that's what matters, rather than outright sort of falsehood. It's kind of that story that people kind of find kind of believable, and then if you repeat it enough, it becomes a story that takes root in the body politic and becomes a starting basis for politics. Okay, and let me just sort of say, one of the things that drives all of these dynamics is the ongoing low levels of trust in institutional media. All right, so when we talk about the state of journalism, one of the things that we have to keep at the center of our story is the fact that journalism as an institution has largely remained the same, more or less. There's very strong professional ethics. I see many brilliant young reporters who are nonpartisan, who are committed journalists and professionals, committed to the ethics and the craft to get the story right and to convey the story fair and accurately as possible. That's not to say there's not some bad apples, there are, but on the whole, the profession of journalism is strong. The thing is that the public has changed around it. The public has grown much more polarized around the institution of journalism. And what political elites have found out is that by attacking the media, partisans are going to start to agree with them rather than trusting the media. One way I like to think about this is in terms of sports fandom. I'm a Mets fan, I'm a Jets fan, I'm a long-suffering sports fan. I'm from New Jersey. If you're really invested in your team, who are you going to believe in a close, controversial call? Do you believe your star player, or do you side with the ref? No one sides with the ref. Come on, Blue! No one sides with the ref. You side with your star player, right, in a close call. That's the situation journalists find themselves in now. They're there to call the balls and strikes, to enforce the rules of the game as best they can. The challenge is, though, is that as people have grown more polarized and more partisan around them, they start to see calling balls and strikes as being politically motivated and being cast in partisan terms. And you see this, I mean, so Republicans historically, this comes from Pew, have had much less faith in media and trust in media, this is trust in mass media by party, than Democrats, but still relatively high. In '97, about 41%. Democrats were up around 64, independents at 53. Take a look at 2016, only 14% of Republicans trust in mass media at that point. And if we were to disaggregate by outlet, as some future some studies that have come after have done, the trust that Republicans have in Fox News, for instance, or the Wall Street Journal is outsized compared to other media outlets. So they're only trusting what I would argue is ideologically congruent media. And the thing is that Trump knows that's the way the world works, right? So this is just a quote from him in 2017. These journalists are sick people. You know the thing I don't understand. You would think they'd want to make our country great again, but I honestly believe they don't. They don't. The point is that he's speaking to partisans here. He's saying, in essence, they're not on your side. They're not fair brokers. They don't care about the country, right? He's working to delegitimize the press as a professional institution. And that's the world journalists need to figure out. How do we deal with this and how do we navigate this world that's much more partisan, where both sides to extent are going to be more critical and exercise more scrutiny over the press. But Republicans in particular have much less faith in the professional institutional production of knowledge and journalism. And therefore, how are journalists going to figure that out? What is their identity going to be in this new polarized world? So let me stop there, and we can have some questions, and happy to talk about anything. Yeah?
An observation and a question. It's probably a gross oversimplification, but wouldn't you say in the political realm, which is where this kind of centers, really it just goes to salesmanship, whether it's the old newspaper, radio, to TV, to Twitter, Yitter, Facebook, MySpace, whatever.
Yeah.
If I can sell you the product, I stand a better chance of reaping the reward.
Yeah, no. So look, salesmanship has long been a part of politics, right? And people have been decrying the state of democracy for as long as we've had a democracy in the United States, right? So that's nothing new. And part of the salesmanship is to say, I'm going to represent you, right? I'm going to represent your identities, your interests, your religion, your faith. I think what changes, though, is that we're now in a media environment where it's easier to make narrow appeals speaking to just you as opposed to all of Americans. In the era of mass media, right, you couldn't tune out your message for 50% of the public and only speak to a very small, narrow slice. Or you could do it through mail, et cetera, but it was harder. But now in a world of things like Facebook advertising, we can make very targeted appeals just to you. And say, I'm just going to represent your interests and people like you. I don't have to make an appeal to broader Americans. So that's what I think has changed.
And the question,
yeah.
With the advent of real-time media, with the advent of the press supposedly or should be neutral.
Yeah.
Go back to the night of the returns. Clinton. I don't care what TV, what news you looked at, Republican, Independent, Democrat, Clinton didn't win. And you wonder why people just look at the press like the presentation that your personal emotion is like, this is in the bag.
Yeah.
And you wonder we don't, or there are many that don't trust media.
So I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think, and I talk to my students about this all the time, I think one of the big challenges for media is diversity. Diversity in terms of looking like the rest of the country. And the challenge with professional journalism is that they look to bracket out everything that makes people unique, right? So I see this all the time with like my broadcast journalism students. Don't have an accent when you're on television, right? Well, guess what, right? Hey, look, I'm from New Jersey, I have an accent. Y'all might be from like rural North Carolina, you're gonna have an accent too. Like, why don't you want people to represent the communities that they come from and to say, we don't all need to speak like we live in New York City, right? We don't all need to see the world like we live in New York City. And I think we need greater diversity in media precisely for that issue. Yeah?
What you just said, a reason for why there are no longer any party platforms?
Well, there are party platforms. Are you asking like why we have more independent candidates?
Well, you can't get the Democrats to state a unified platform.
Yeah.
I guess it's partly because we're so fractionated even within a party as far as our interests, our selfish interests.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the interesting things about U.S. politics, and it's a great question, is that since the early 1970s, you've seen parties lose control of their nominating processes, right? So this happened with the McGovern-Fraser reforms that sort of took root post 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention. Parties looked to make things much more open to primaries. What happened is that in the context of doing that, they opened a door to more independent and autonomous candidates who could run their own primaries on the basis of the money and consultants and their own boots on the ground that they could put out there. One of the things about the Republican Party is just how weak it was and that it wasn't able to stop Donald Trump, an outsider to their party, and here I'm speaking about institutional Republicans, from basically taking over the party, right? And who had very different policy positions that a lot of other candidates had. You see the same thing on the Democratic side, right? So Bernie Sanders is try to run at the institutional Democratic Party as an independent, right? showed how weak the Democratic Party was and how there's no there. So I think what we have in a modern media system with different electoral rules is two much more fragmented parties where basically individual candidates can make their own specialized appeals to voters. Yeah, in the back.
All right. Almost 50 years ago to the day, Walter Cronkite, having returned from his reporting on the Tet Offensive, informed the American people that war in Vietnam could not be won.
Yep.
At that point in time, he was known as the most trusted man in America.
Yep.
How did we get from there to here?
Yeah.
And how do we fix it?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, right? I think part of that, how did we get from there to here? It's part of that story of the increasing polarization of the American electorate and elites. And with that comes declining institutional trust in those referees. In part because politicians realized that they could attack the press and their partisans wouldn't care. Their partisans would stay with them as they attacked the press, right? That's part of the story. I think the other part of the story is that we're in a much more fragmented media environment. People are consuming cable channels. People are consuming hundreds of different media outlets. People are getting their information from hundreds of different institutional sources. As that happens, there's no one common center anymore that can sort of ground the nation and be that voice, not only of journalism and the empirical facts on the ground, but also of morality, right? Like Walter Cronkite was a voice of the American people. He could represent the public, both to the public and also to legislators themselves. How do we put the genie back in that bottle? I don't know. Do you have any ideas? I mean, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I got one.
Yeah, please.
I'm an independent voter.
Yeah.
I've been a Democrat, I've been a Republican, and I don't like
Yeah.
that part.
Yeah.
But I sense a bias coming from the media that is very palpable. I can see it and I can hear it, and I think something needs to be done about that. Right now, it's two armed camps, it seems like.
Yep.
There's
Yep.
nothing, there's no middle ground anywhere. I mean, one of the things that I personally find interesting about what you said about, everybody's advertising to their partisans, to their tribe.
Yep.
But yet the Clinton campaign forgot the part of their tribe that was in the Rust Belt. And it killed them. They lost that election because they took them totally for granted, and the Trump people appealed to them. So maybe the tribal thing isn't as set in stone as it may appear at the moment. Somebody needs to talk to the middle. The middle is what actually elects the people. The middle people, the unaffiliated voters, are the voters who actually win and lose elections in this country.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think the question is like who is that person or that institution that can speak to the middle currently? I'll go back to what I said earlier. Like so if I were to look at where we need to change, right? Like I think we need more diversity in media. I think we need to revitalize state media and regional media and local media. We need more resources because oftentimes the chances, the places where we could be the least polarized is on the state level and in local communities, right? Because we all have to get along with one another. We don't have to fight abstract battles, right, on a national basis. What we've seen in this country is the nationalization of all politics. And I think that in that we lose something. So if I were to sort of set out, like, how do we put the Cronkite in a bottle? Or go back sort of to that time, maybe we don't just need one Cronkite. Maybe we need 50 different Cronkites in 50 states. And that the way to do that would be to revitalize local media institutions. And I also think that we need more forums to have dialogue, to plug your talk on Friday. But like, look, we need more forums where we can get folks together from different opposing camps. I'm hosting Tucker Carlson at UNC on Thursday for a conversation, with 3 students. And the students up there next to me, some are from the left, some are from the right. I chose them. I made sure that there was partisan balance because I wanted to create some forum where people could have a reasoned give and take and could explain the reasons why they vote. Though we need more institutions and more fora like that. And we need to find places where people can convene that. Yeah?
I think Hillary was a very flawed candidate to begin with, in that there was a lot of doubt as to her honesty,
Yeah.
the type of foundation and where they were getting their money,
Yep.
to have sold uranium to the Russians. I mean, she was just a poor candidate to begin with, and then it came to be, I think, who can you trust? Eight more years of Obama was certainly not an option for many people. When you lower our military to what it was prior to World War II, that's not a good platform to start with. And it would have been a continuation, a deterioration of our military.
Yeah, so, I mean, look, I think politics is a give and take, and people have reasons for voting for Trump or voting for Clinton. I mean, I'm agnostic about that. I'm a social scientist. I'm not making a set of political arguments here. But I think people, certainly have their reasons for voting for and against any particular candidate and have rationales for it. Yeah. Yeah, please.
This Russian thing troubles me.
Yeah.
I've never worried about the Russians in our elections before. I mean, obviously, those that you showed, I would recognize them.
Yeah.
But I recognize the influence that they have. Are they smarter than we are?
Huh. So this worries me a lot too. There's two big worries I have. This is one of them, right? So it's the ways in which companies like Facebook failed to safeguard their platforms against outside interference in the election. Look, this is a nonpartisan issue. Doesn't matter whether you're a Trump supporter or a Clinton supporter. The fact that Russian agents were able to set up accounts and pass them off as being American activist groups and organizations. The fact that they were able to just waltz in and buy hundreds of thousands of dollars in advertising. The fact that Facebook was able to have its data breached, that had data on 87 million Americans to a shadowy foreign organization and foreign firm that was barred from making organizational decisions in American campaigns under US law should all be deeply disturbing. I think Russian psych ops are pretty developed. They've clearly shown that they can pour a lot of resources in this, and even more, have shown that they can play the identity politics game and try to at least distort the conversations that we're having in the US. I think we need to take that threat seriously. And part of taking that seriously means holding Facebook accountable for what it's done and what it should do in the future. And part of it would be let the independent prosecutor do its job in terms of trying to disentangle what was that actual role and how did it play out in the US election. So I would say that. The other thing I really worry about, and I think this relates, is that I worry about negative partisanship. Negative partisanship is a political science term to say that we view the other side, regardless of where we sit, as bad for the country. And ultimately as illegitimate. It's a rejection of pluralism, right? And we see this all over. We see that people are now less approving of inter-party marriages than in things like mixed race or mixed ethnic marriages. I kid you not. Like, people would be more upset if their son or daughter brought home a Republican or a Democrat than a member of another race. Now, what's dangerous about that is that opens the door to viewing the other side as illegitimate and as being bad for the country. And that, in turn, opens the door for the erosion of democratic norms and the erosion of competitive elections. The thing that democracy hinges on is that we can win and lose every 4 years or every 2 years. And that our team might lose, but we're all going to commit to continue to play the game. I see a dangerous erosion of respect for competitive elections in the US. Yeah.
One thing that's going on with this, whatever happens, especially in the political realm, when you have debates, when you have the election, anything where they actually sat down and just talked about what I want to do for this country, what's going to go on, what am I going to do? Instead of, no, you slept with Sobway and this and that. It's all junk now. There's no political, there's nothing what you're going to do for the country and for us. It's all who slept with who and who did this to what. And it's soap operas out there.
Yeah. All right, so that's another great point. So one of the reasons why we lost the Walter Cronkites of the world, and this goes back to journalism as an institution, is that the profession has also figured out that something sells. Right? Like, I've got a 7-year-old daughter, so I'm not going to say that out loud, too loud. But, it sells. And it's the tabloidization of large swaths, not all. There's a lot of serious journalism out there that's very careful. But they know that what sells is the salaciousness of politics, the bedroom politics of politics. And therefore, you can get mileage and clicks. And part of the pernicious story about American journalism is the ways in which, as I said before, I think the profession is still strong. I think ethical standards are still strong. However, when you have firms, when you have media companies that are struggling for revenue, and you can see in the digital world, everything is monetized. I was up at the Washington Post recently, and they have big screens that show all their traffic on all their stories come in up to the second, right? It's constantly refreshed and updated. In that world, when you're a journalist and you could figure out, well, where's the money coming from? What are readers clicking on, right? What are people paying attention to? It's the most salacious and most scandal-ridden coverage. That's driving clicks, it's driving views, which in turn is driving then people are going to start writing for their audience because that's the only way they can make money.
That's going to drive things where you bring home a Republican into my house, or you bring home a Libertarian.
That's right. That's right.
It's divided. It's the hate
that's right.
there.
That's right.
And it's all it is. I saw a big headline the other day, Black Lives Matter. And I'm not saying, don't misquote me, but all lives matter. I don't care if you're black, white, purple, or green. And to stand up there and kept saying, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, well, you're telling me now that white lives don't matter.
Well, I think
you're pushing the fact that just because, you're the only one out there. No, we're all out there fighting the same thing. We should all come together, not keep fighting.
Well, I want to disentangle two things here, right? So there's sort of this institutional story where salacious coverage, fake news, right, identity politics is something that gets rewarded in algorithms and rewarded in digital clicks online, which means we get more of it and you see more of it, and it tends to reward your own side and things that you already agree with. What I will say in the context of Black Lives Matter is that that's a social movement that was grown up around a very particular problem, which is the fact, yeah.
It's all growing. It's not just one little thing, but it's all growing so that the political, the media, everything is
which is
the
right.
Everybody is out there, against this, against this, against this, against this. That's, it's all the same thing. It's just like I'm saying, the Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
One small portion of it.
So I think broadly, and then I saw a question over here. I think we have a civic obligation to listen to one another, right? Social movement groups like Black Lives Matter are making an argument that says, yes, all lives matter, but black people are disproportionately killed by law enforcement or disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system. It's not a rejection of all lives matter. It's to say that we as a community face a particular problem and we need you to be our allies in this. And I think one of the things that we all have is to say we can all listen to one another and have an obligation to listen to one another civically, but that doesn't take away from your own experience. And it doesn't take away from the people that Trump was able to appeal to in terms of people who felt left out of discourse in other societies. And I think what I would say is we just have that obligation to stop, to take a step back from the stuff we see and to try to listen across the divide.
I'm just saying how it's deliberate, it's making
parochial appeals in some way. Yeah.
against each other instead of actually bringing us together.
Okay, so
This will be our last question.
Okay, yeah.
I was intrigued by your list earlier of where some of the workers on political parties come And would you suggest that not only is there mistrust for the media now, that there is a mistrust, particularly of elite higher ed?
Yes.
And that
Yeah.
they've gotten somehow sucked up into that general mistrust. And interestingly enough, I see it fall on partisan lines, but you also have some of the most popular comedians in the world who are either wildly left or wildly right. Both agree that I'm not going to large Research One elite campuses anymore because I'm afraid of what I might say will offend someone. And I think that has bred some mistrust among the news journalism students who are coming out of the Chapel Hills, the Northwesterns, Columbias.
That's a great last question because I think it speaks to a bunch of bigger concerns. And I guess I'll sort of speak to that in two ways. The first is to say that I completely agree with you that there's a broader growing distrust of knowledge-producing institutions of all stripes. Some of that is politically motivated. So attacks on scientists, for instance, in the context of something like climate change, where we do have overwhelming evidence and overwhelming consensus among scientists that climate change is real and at least in significant part that it's human caused, right? Attacks on the workings of the institution of science can often be politically motivated by certain people who have interests about it. I would also say, though, is that as social scientists, as institutions of higher ed, like we have a certain commitment to the public. My commitment is to be a social scientist at the end of the day, not a political advocate. I'm not advancing my political values, my political parties, my political stances in the classroom. I'm not advancing it on campus, and I'm not advancing it here in the room. I'm a social scientist at the end of the day. What does that mean? That means that I deal with evidence and logic and reason. I submit my work to peer review. I look to have people critique me as much as possible. And I have good working relationships with people on both sides of the aisle because I am impartial when it comes to producing knowledge, right? And I think that some quarters of the academy have moved away from that view in certain ways. I do think that there is a crisis of speech that can exist on college campuses. I work very hard I'm fortunate enough at Chapel Hill to be able to have classes that I teach by nomination only. So I can actually have partisan balance in my room, in my classroom. And when I talk to conservative students, they absolutely feel like their voices can be foreclosed and they're not heard. And that causes people to retreat in certain enclaves. And guess what? I think it makes the rigor of logic and argument on the left worse too, because they never actually have to engage with another side or see another view of somebody who might not agree with them. So this goes back to the earlier question, like I do think that we have a responsibility as educators in higher ed to engineer forums where we can have a very real give and take and exchange. And I would also say that this doesn't just exist for left and right, Democrat or Republican, but it's about creating spaces for a range of views within the Republican Party or within the Democratic Party to be heard, right? Because that's an important context of debate too. Not all Republicans are alike. Not all Democrats are alike. And I think that we need to figure out a way to create those spaces so that people can feel like higher ed is a place where we can have difficult conversations from a good place, good faith arguments where we can take one another's voices seriously as Americans and view like they're coming from their authentic selves. Thank you.
Okay. Is the discussion you're going to have with Carlson going to be televised?
I believe under his contract it will not be. That's what I understand. But if you just go over to the UNC School of Media and Journalism website, you can find it. But I believe he set the terms of that, not us. Yeah.
And y'all, this is the first time I've let it go over this long, and I apologize.
No problem. Thank you.
And I would just like to remind you that the next time we'll be meeting in here, Walnut 101, will be June 18th, Dr. Roy Heidecker will be talking about the North African campaign. I hope to see you there. And then I'd also like to tell you about something that just came to my attention, and that is that our own Emily will be giving a lecture about the legacy of Goldsboro's Woman Club, and it'll be at the Wayne County Museum on April the 14th. Is that right, Emily? At noon. Okay. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you.